Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Lauren Christensen, Senior Staff Editor on the Books Desk at the New York Times. I'm joined today by Carl Zimmer, the New York Times' Matter columnist, and he's also the author of 13 books, including one called A Planet of Viruses. So he's definitely the best person, or one of the best people to answer our questions about the coronavirus. And today we're going to focus on the efforts to find drugs that can stop the virus. Quick note before we start. The conversation is being recorded and it's audio only, and you can always submit questions throughout the conversation using the Q&A feature in Zoom. So if you do that, please include your name and the town you're coming from. So on Friday, the FDA gave emergency approval for the drug remdesivir for those with severe cases of COVID-19. It's just one of many drugs that scientists are looking at to repurpose as potential treatments. So Carl, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Before explaining how these drugs work, can you first give us a really basic understanding, if there is one, of what the coronavirus does to the body?
Sure. So the coronavirus is, it's a respiratory virus in the sense that it goes into your airway. So it can infect the cells in your nose, and or it can get in by your eyes or your mouth and get into the membranes there. And then it makes its way down to the lungs. And as it goes, it is invading cells and basically hijacking them to make new viruses. It starts to cause, in some people, a whole host of symptoms. It can cause kind of a pneumonia. It can lead, in some people, to really severe respiratory distress. Some people will then have to go on a ventilator. But we're also discovering that the effects can spread to other organs. So some people will suffer really bad kidney damage. There are reports of young people having strokes. It seems to involve the heart. This is a very serious disease, and it's certainly not, quote unquote, just the flu. Now, at the same time, a lot of people can get infected with the virus and not even know it. They don't have serious symptoms, and so that makes it all the more difficult to contain and control in order to protect people as a whole from it. So yeah, so it's a really challenging virus to be contending with now that it's becoming a pandemic.
Right. So, I mean, let's start with remdesivir. Since it was reported last week, it's really the first drug to get approval for treating COVID patients. We'd heard all of that news about the malaria drug, and then that wasn't going to work. And how promising is this one?
Well, remdesivir is the first drug to go through a randomized controlled trial and to show some effects. And so that's a good thing. Now, it's not a panacea by any means. It reduced mortality. People who took the drug versus people who didn't. The people who took the drug, or given the drug, I should say, 8% of them died. And that's as opposed to 11.6% of the people who didn't take the drug, who took the placebo. So there are still people who are taking remdesivir and dying. That wasn't a statistically significant effect, but there was a statistically significant effect in terms of the length of people's sickness on average. It went from 15 days to 11 days on average. So that's good. And it's certainly a good place to start. And the hope is that this will be the first of a number of drugs that will fight the disease, maybe in many different ways. And, maybe different people will get different drugs, or maybe people will get cocktails. And, maybe it'll be important to take these early to sort of nip the infection in the bud. So this is sort of this is a first step.
Mm-hmm. That leads me to my next question. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. This is my really just armchair epidemiology understanding of the pharmaceutical approaches to eradicating a virus. It's that there are three different approaches. So there's a vaccine, there's a treatment, and a cure. I mean, how separate are each of these research processes? I mean, remdesivir, as you said, is certainly not a cure.
Well, the different approaches are basically how do you fight the virus when someone gets sick,
Hmm.
and how do you prevent people from getting sick in the first place?
Right.
And there is a little overlap there because the vaccines that people are working on now, the goal is to have people make antibodies that can wipe out the virus. Um, it just so happens that other scientists are looking at basically collecting antibodies, maybe from people who are sick, or maybe even making them from scratch, and then injecting them into people. That could be, you might do that for, say, healthcare workers. Say, like, we're going to give you a sort of a temporary boost to your immune system with these antibodies, just so that you don't get sick while you're dealing with lots of sick patients all the time while we're waiting for a vaccine to be developed.
Hmm. But now that you've brought up antibodies, what happened with the antibody test? I mean, I personally know tons of people who are running out to get the test and who think, oh, I was a little sick a couple months ago, maybe I had it. And they're getting this test, which is separate from the diagnostic test. But, there are concerns that it's not so reliable. Is that right?
Yes, it is a serious issue. So there are two kinds of tests. So one test is basically a way to find out if you currently have an active infection. And the way to do that is to see if you can find any of the genetic material of the virus in someone's nose, or maybe in someone's saliva, which would be nice because I don't know about you, but I don't want a pipe cleaner stuck all the way
Oh,
back
that
into my
sounds
brain.
awful. Yeah.
Yeah, but a poor of Mandevilla is reported for the Times on how the saliva tests are starting to show some real promise, which is great. So you can find out if you are actively infected by taking one of these tests. There are a lot of problems with these tests those tests in that sometimes they give a false signal, and the other issue is that they can be slow. There can be a real backlog with them. That's one issue. Now, the antibody tests are a little different in the sense that you don't really generally, these aren't going to be used to figure out if you have an active infection. What they'll really be used for, and they're being used right now, is to kind of get a rough idea of who has been exposed.
Mhm.
Now, the FDA, as we've reported, kind of opened up the floodgates and let a lot of antibody tests through, just approving them because this is an emergency. And now it's becoming clear that some of them are quite low quality.
Great.
This is particularly a problem when there are only a few percent of people in the United States who've been exposed. And so when you've got a signal that's that rare, then if you've got a test that sometimes gives you a false positive or false negative, it can become really unreliable. So in
Yeah.
other words, you could get a result and just not trust it.
Right.
The tests are getting better though, and some of them the FDA is starting to ratchet things back. So I would hold off, and certainly people should not start planning on, oh, I'm going to go to work based on a test that I take today.
Right.
But on the other hand, New York State and other places are actually using tests to just test lots and lots of people. And while, any individual, the results might not be right, overall, you start to get a pretty good picture of what we're looking at. And in New York City, you're starting to see estimates 10, 15, maybe even over 20% in some boroughs of people actually have already had COVID-19. And they
My
just,
God.
they had infections and didn't even, most of them didn't even realize it probably.
Right. One of our listeners actually asked when synthetic antibodies would be available. And if you could also explain for people like me what exactly a synthetic antibody is.
Sure. Basically, so our bodies are really good at making antibodies, and thank goodness, because we'd be dead if pretty quickly if we couldn't.
Mhm.
And our bodies learn how to make antibodies either by being exposed to pathogens or through vaccines, which safely teach us how to make new antibodies through the natural process without us getting sick. now you can, for people, and when people have gotten over COVID-19, there are people who are now volunteering to have some of their blood drawn so that scientists can take their antibodies and that they've made and give them to sick people and see if that helps. We don't know yet how well they help, but there's some reason to think they might.
Okay.
But you can then, if you find an antibody that someone has made and you find like, wow, this antibody really does a great job of stopping this virus. Well, that antibody is a pretty simple molecule, and there are ways to just manufacture that antibody in a lab. So you can make exactly the same molecule by the billions, by the trillions, and now you have what's called a monoclonal antibody, which has been synthesized, which has been produced in a lab, and now you can use that as a treatment. Monoclonal antibodies are being used for a lot of different diseases now. So we know that it can work, and so it's possible that this might become one of the treatments for COVID-19.
So given the disparity in the symptoms that lots of different people are experiencing, and really the severity of the virus, that is being contracted, I assume not everyone who has it will have access to or even need to take an antiviral medication. I mean, is that something, or is it something everyone is going to be encouraged to take? I mean, can you just go to CVS and get a prescription for remdesivir and just kind of have it on your nightstand? Or are these drugs that can only be administered under doctor's supervision? I mean, what does this look like as a drug?
Well, remdesivir definitely has side effects, and there are things that need to be very, carefully managed by doctors. So no, this won't be. I have a hard time imagining people just walking into CVS and buying remdesivir over the counter. But that being certainly there are lots of antivirals that are in widespread use. There are lots of people with HIV infections regularly take drugs that inhibit the virus, and they just take it on a regular basis. So, you could imagine, maybe people might, just call their doctor and say like, hey, I came down with a fever last night and I used my at-home, COVID test and I tested positive. And then the doctor would be like, all right, well, I'm calling in a prescription for some antiviral, because it's possible that giving people treatments early will give an edge,
Right.
because we know this from like influenza, like
Right.
flu, you want to get them onto antivirals for the flu sooner rather than later. Might be also true for COVID-19.
Now, just a more general question about drug repurposing. How did it come about that a drug, because remdesivir had originally been tested and failed in treating Ebola and hepatitis. How would that have even come about as something that would be flagged in a lab as a potential way to help COVID patients?
Well, the antiviral remdesivir, it worked. It did actually show antiviral activity in experiments starting with cells and then doing some animal studies. Like a lot of drugs, when you get to humans, for one reason or another, it may not work out for a particular disease. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it won't work for any disease. And so, so basically, it had this potential promise, and so Gilead and just went ahead with sort of starting to check out, maybe this works on another disease. What's interesting is that in it there are these drugs that are treated as antivirals, but then there are actually other drugs that might actually be antivirals in hiding. So I've written an article about how there are a couple dozen drugs or more that are FDA approved for allergies, for schizophrenia, for Parkinson's, for cancer, for a whole range of disorders. And if you test them out in a dish of cells, they're really good at knocking out the coronavirus. So some of those are now also going into animal tests and may soon be going into clinical trials on people. So, biology is complicated, and, one drug may be able to do lots of different things. The flip side of that is that one drug may treat a disease and also cause side effects.
Right.
So you really need to be careful and not start popping a drug just because you heard it works. You need to let science do its thing.
Yeah, your article last week quoted one researcher as saying something like, "We don't know a lot about why drugs do what they do," which kind of alarmed me. Scientists started with thousands of potential drugs that could be repurposed. Is it a little like trial and error? Because it kind of sounds like that, the process.
There's some trial and error, but there's also ways of of being able to sort of inform your guesses. If you
Right.
understand the biology of the virus, you can sort of say like, well, I think that, we know, for example, that there are a couple proteins in our cells that the coronavirus really depends on in order to have a good infection. So once you know that, you can say like, well, okay, well, are there any drugs out there that might be able to sort of grab onto that protein and prevent the virus from using it? And there are. And so that kind of like informed guess lets you get started. But, there's still, the fact is that, a very small fraction of candidate drugs for any disease make it all the way from a promising test in cells to actually working in people. So, we have to be realistic about that. But the flip side is that, scientists are looking at literally tens of thousands of drugs, and we only need a few to win this fight.
Yeah. What made remdesivir different from all these others, if that's not too complicated to explain?
Well, I don't know if it is all that different, honestly. I mean, I think that it happened to be a good one that was, already kind of standing in line, and and had a company that had, a lot of interest in trying it out again, and there was interest in the government in supporting research, and so yeah, it'll be interesting to see, like in a year, what we think of remdesivir. I
Yeah.
don't know if people will still be using it. I don't know. I mean, maybe people will, and maybe it'll be, or maybe it'll be in combination with something. But like I say, like it just it is the first one to come out of a random controlled trial with some solid results. But now we're going to have to wait and see like how many lives does it actually save in use, because now the FDA is giving it an emergency approval.
Right. The FDA has approved it, but in the process of coming up with all of this research, all the laboratories around the country and around the world who were sort of conducting all of these tests, how were they interfacing with the federal government? Was there support? Was there coordination? How coordinated was this effort?
Well, semi-coordinated maybe. I mean, there is a lot of, it has been quite a scramble. And, there have been sort of long running, relationships between the National Institutes of Health and other parts of the government and university labs and these commercial interests. Those have been existing for a long time. And so some of what we're seeing is sort of just that carrying over till now. The NIH has actually started an initiative to really try to herd cats and to bring together companies and universities supported by NIH grants, and really try to sort of try to coordinate things better, because while it's great that there's a big vigorous all hands on deck kind of scramble to do this research, there's a risk that people are going to be kind of just repeating each other, or might be going
Right.
down dead ends that really, are kind of a waste of time. And if they just talked to somebody else, they would have known they were going to waste their time. So, so hopefully there will be more of this coordination.
Where's the money coming from?
Well, a lot of the money is coming from government
Yeah.
organizations.
Yeah.
I mean, government funding and NIH, for example. Philanthropies are putting up a lot of money too. The Gates Foundation and others, and certainly there are governments in other countries as well that are also supporting a lot of this research. So it's coming from a lot of different places.
Yeah. I mean, and now outside the US, I mean, are labs around the world working together? I mean, do you think it's going to be a joint effort? Do you think there's going to be one key figure in this race, kind of like the Jonas Salk of COVID? I mean, are there political ramifications? We've just been calling it a race to find a cure. And is it really a race, against each other? Are we on the same side? I'm just curious about that.
Well, I think that it's sort of a mixture. I mean, certainly there are national rivalries, and certainly the sort of international relations between countries like the United States and China, which are fraught to say the least,
Mhm.
are a factor in how all this is going to play out.
Yeah.
That being said, there is a tremendous amount of international collaboration that's going on. Science in general had been getting more and more international in the past decade or two, and that was in part because a lot of places like China had been training up their scientific forces, and so that they have a lot of first-rate science. Also, the internet sort of allows people to work across the globe, and we sort of take the internet for granted, but it really has profoundly transformed science in the past, say,
Yeah.
20 years. And so people can pool their resources and and put data online, and they're not waiting for peer-reviewed papers to appear in journals. They're taking their data and they're putting them in repositories. So if you want to study how the virus is spreading around the world and is it mutating, is that going to affect how you make a vaccine, you can go online and just look at the over 4,000 genomes of this virus that have been sequenced from dozens of countries, and you can just analyze it because everyone's pooled their stuff together.
Right.
And so that has accelerated our understanding and insight into this disease enormously.
Hmm. Now, for our audience, what advice can you give us as we're all reading the news about promising studies or the next potential drug? Just things to keep in mind to kind of weed through all of the noise.
Yeah, I do think, I do think for readers, for their own sanity, really do need to be rigorous in how they take in information. So if a family member posts on their Facebook page that, oh, hey, a friend of a friend of a friend sent me this, and this is like a great test to know if you have COVID, hold your breath for 10 seconds. Some expert in Taiwan apparently says this, that could very well be not true. In fact, it isn't true. That is one meme that's flying around and it's just not true.
Mhm.
So you just have to sort of accept that there will be misinformation out there. So if your first thing is to say, is this misinformation? That doesn't mean you get to sort of distrust anything that doesn't fit your preconceived notions. If you read an article, is it based on a preprint or something that's come out in a peer-reviewed journal? A preprint, well, like that doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong, but did the reporter then do the work of talking to some outside experts to get their judgment on it? Because there's a lot of stuff in preprints that's just wrong and really misleading. But there's a lot of reporting on it. And you also need to sort of like it helps to learn more about just how science works in general.
Yeah.
So science, it's very frustrating to have to wait for randomized clinical trials to finish and to see what those results are. It would be nice for to hear that some doctor gave somebody a drug and they got better, and voila, we have the answer. But if one doctor gives one patient one drug and then that patient gets better, you don't know if the drug made them better.
Right.
They might have gotten better on their own. I mean, people recover from COVID a lot. So, so how do you know that the drug actually made a difference?
Mhm.
And so, getting to understand how science works, if science is something that maybe you're not that familiar with, that can be helpful too.
Okay. I'm going to go to some of the audience questions now. Jed asks, if there is a therapeutic treatment in the future, how are we going to distribute it to the people? And, he's concerned that this is going to become, is this going to become another case of the haves versus the have-nots?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, in the certainly in the United States, when it comes to healthcare, we have a lot of problems with the haves and the have-nots. We have a lot of people who are sick because of being unable to access good healthcare. So that's a good question. I'm not sure that's the answer is going to lie in how we deal with one particular drug. You're going to have to think about political systems, social systems to get that broader answer to that. Now, that being said, there are a lot of initiatives that are going on to get, for example, vaccines to as many people around the world as possible. And there are organizations like Gavi that are really good at doing this, at being basically, if you can tell a drug maker, like, look, I guarantee you that I'm going to buy billions of dollars of this vaccine. And because I'm going to then distribute it to, a bunch of these countries where people need it, that allows those companies to actually take that risk to make those vaccines without thinking like this could totally go down the tubes. So, so there are initiatives that people are developing that could specifically help for COVID-19. But I think the bigger issue is that we have a healthcare system that is quite broken.
Yeah, I mean, a related question. Sony asked, how do you think our healthcare system is adequately prepared to even just deliver us this drug once it's approved and in circulation? I mean, is that a concern?
Sure, it's a concern. Yeah, I mean, how how much is remdesivir going to cost, and how much, and who's going to pay for it? I mean, those are big, important questions. It's a big, important question for any antiviral that turns out to work. But Gilead, the maker of remdesivir, has the New York Times has reported on how they have charged incredible amounts of money, upwards of $80,000 for a hepatitis antiviral. Now, this is an antiviral that will clear you of one of the forms of hepatitis. It works, but Gilead wanted a whole lot of money for it. And so should they be allowed to do that? I mean, or if they are going to do that, should we just have the government just eat that cost? And we also have to remember that a lot of this research that leads to things like remdesivir starts off as government sponsored research. In other words, paid for by tax dollars.
Right.
And so we need to ask, like, well, okay, what does that mean in terms of how much, profit that these drug companies can make when they turn around and sell these things to us? Now, it is true also that these big drug companies, they have to sink a lot of money into the development of these drugs. It's not like they just take government funded research and then just start selling it. So it's kind of a long answer to a very good question, but it's an important issue.
I think a lot of us are struggling with the anxiety of the just not knowing what the timeline is with any of this, when we're going to go back to work, when things are going to go open up. And especially, and I think a lot of that obviously depends on the timeline for effective drug treatments. Do you have, I mean, I know this is like asking you to play God, but do you have any sense, I mean, is there any vague estimated timeline that you have for, when you think we'll be able to see some kind of effective drugs or vaccines?
Well, I can tell you what are the sorts of things that scientists muse about when we have conversations. So, I was recently in an exchange with a scientist about antivirals, and we got to talking about, well, what does the research so far make him think about what things are going to be like? And he said, well, I think that in the fall, we might very well have a variety of antivirals that we can use on their own or in a cocktail. And some of them might fight the virus. Some of them might actually control the immune system, because that is actually a big factor in why people get sick. Our own immune system goes in overload. So maybe there will be a drug. There are drugs in clinical trials right now. So maybe one will come out and be effective. So, you could imagine that, by the fall that having COVID-19 would be, a much more manageable condition. I mean, people would still be dying, but the hope would be that fewer people would be dying. So, I don't think that then becomes, an opportunity to just kick back and say, everything's back to normal. I don't think we're going to be back to normal for quite a while. Now, if there's a vaccine that proves to be really effective and safe, and it has gotten to billions of people, then we're starting to look at a much more normal situation. And their safety trials have begun for some vaccines. They're already getting jabbed into people, which is in the vaccine world, that is lightning fast. We didn't even know about this virus until a few months ago. Yeah. The most optimistic promises or vague, possibilities, let's put it that way, is that there would be millions of vaccines in production at the end of this year or at the beginning of next year. I said millions, not billions. So, getting the whole world vaccinated could take a while after that. And so, so, I mean, I would say with, if you're thinking on the timeline of say 2 years from now or 3 years from now, I'm pretty optimistic, but I don't think we should be thinking about life as normal anytime soon.
Right. So in that scenario, let's say it's early 2021 and we have an effective vaccine. How could, and Mona in Encinitas, California, and also another listener, Marianne, asked a question that kind of is chilling to me. How could mutations of the coronavirus affect how useful any drug or vaccine would be once we've gone through all these steps to come up with it?
Oh, that's a great question. So I'll preface an answer by just talking a little bit about mutations, because as scientists sequence the genomes of these samples of the coronavirus, they can see that new mutations pop up, so that you have one lineage of viruses is got a mutation in a certain gene that you don't see in other viruses. Now, if you read about that, you might say, oh my God, mutations, mutant viruses, this is just like a bad movie, we're all going to die. And that's not the case. And the reason it's not the case is that viruses mutate all the time. Viruses are just rampant mutators. And so anytime you get a cold or the flu or whatever, as those viruses are replicating, they are mutating. They have a very high mutation rate. And most of those mutations are really bad for the virus. They can't replicate anymore. Most of the rest are kind of neutral. They don't really affect the virus one way or the other. So if scientists see like a mutation becoming more common, let's say in the United States, a lot of the time it's just because because the virus itself just by chance happens to be the one that showed up in the United States and found a lot of people to infect. It doesn't mean that somehow the virus is more dangerous or more contagious or anything. Now, all that being said, there are sometimes mutations that do affect how a virus works, how sick it makes us, can it escape our immune system? And that is of serious concern for vaccine makers. They're actually there are some viruses that if you want to get a vaccine for it, you essentially have to get a vaccine for several different versions of the virus.
Right.
Because your immune system needs to learn how to fight against several different versions of it. But thankfully, coronavirus is not one of those viruses. Basically, it's kind of a slowpoke in the viral world. It doesn't mutate that fast. And so the hope is that a vaccine could provide, some protection for, a decent amount of time. You might, I don't know, some people have speculated that it might have to be an annual shot. Some people have said it might be a shot where you need a booster after a few years, and then a few years after that. Some people said, no, maybe it's lifetime protection. We don't know now. The experiments to find out are happening right now in people and in animals. But in your list of concerns, mutations should not be high on that list. I think your concern should be, did I remember to wash my hands when I came back from shopping? Like, that's the thing to think about right now, that sort of stuff.
Okay. And you've been studying viruses for a long time, and they've certainly been around for a very long time, but this is, stay-at-home orders are just not something that most people face in a lifetime, at least more than once. How rare is coronavirus? How unique is it amongst the virus world? So let's say we cure this, could there just be another, virus like this that creates another mass pandemic?
Yep. Oh yeah, absolutely. Oh yeah. We need to be thinking about Corona 22 and Corona 25.
Right.
Jennifer Kahn in the New York Times Magazine wrote a really nice piece about how we can prepare for this to happen again. Scientists and journalists like Laurie Garrett had been warning us for 20 years that this was going to happen. And I would say, kind of on the whole, people didn't listen. And now it's happening exactly as people had said. You could go back and watch the movie Contagion. That was 2011. And there's a lot that has played out the way they predicted.
Yeah.
So what about going forward? Well, there are a lot of other coronaviruses that are related to this one, which might have the same ability to infect us. So we need to get ready by having, really having like vaccines, a whole battery of potential vaccines at the ready. That's one thing. We need to be surveying the animals where these coronaviruses live. Bats are one good place to look, but there are other mammals too. We need to be more aware of the viruses in wildlife. And we need to back off. We need to back off of the places where bats live, because otherwise we're just going to be up close and putting so much pressure on them. We're going to be interacting with them. And that's going to up the chances of another spillover. So there are lots of things that we can do to avoid the next pandemic. And it's obvious that we weren't doing enough before. Maybe now, through this terrible toll, we're going to be better prepared for the future.
We have just about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to ask one, maybe two more audience questions. One is from Sophie in Arizona. She asks, can antivirals be dangerous to the human microbiome the way that antibiotics can?
That's an interesting question. I would say no, mainly because so our microbiome is trillions of bacteria plus fungi plus viruses that just inhabit us while we're healthy, and actually are probably pretty important to our health. The vast majority of the viruses in your body, trillions of them, the vast majority of them, they're infecting bacteria, not our cells. And so an antiviral good at stopping a virus from replicating in a human cell is probably going to be terrible at stopping a virus replicating in bacteria. we're fundamentally different organisms separated by billions of years of evolution. So, so I wouldn't see much cause for concern about that. But it is true that antibiotics, are really, we have to learn a lot more about how they affect the microbiome. And there's a lot of research going into more targeted antibiotics that could go after, maybe one strain of bacteria without knocking out a bunch of other bacteria that are actually good for you.
And my last question is sort of zooming out from your scientist hat, perhaps, but Lucy asks, Maggie Haberman just reported that the White House is considering winding down the coronavirus task force in the next few weeks. When you read that, heard that, what are your thoughts on that? How could that really affect this effort?
Well, I don't understand why someone would make that decision. We are hardly out of the woods, and in fact, there's a lot of modeling, some of which is being done, through the government, that we could very well be looking not at a decline of coronavirus cases going forward in the next few months, but a new wave. So if you thought that this last wave, which was horrific, which it was, letting our guard down and just pretending that everything's fine could lead to something even worse. And we shouldn't count on the summer somehow magically killing this virus. This is a virus that is having a field day with us because our immune systems have never seen it before. No one on Earth has immunity to this virus because it is so new. And we're still trying to figure out the diseases it causes. We're still trying to figure out how it transmits. And so any move by our government that would somehow make us less able to reckon with this unprecedented threat is beyond me.
Well, on that sunny note, I know we're out of time. I could talk to you for hours longer, but I just wanted to thank you so much, Carl, for joining us today. For those listening, Carl he's the author of 13 books, including A Planet of Viruses and of the Times' science column called Matter. This event is part of an ongoing conversation series of the New York Times journalists that takes place every Tuesday at 4 Eastern. Next week, you have to look forward to, on May 12th at 4, you can hear from Dr. Tom Frieden, the former director of the Centers for Disease Control, who'll be discussing why testing capacity is still so limited and whether it's wise for states to reopen. To find out more about our full slate of digital events, please visit timesevents.nytimes.com. And of course, finally, we want to give a special thank you to all of our subscribers. You obviously make our work possible, and we look forward to speaking with you and seeing you soon again. Thank you.